Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon has become one of the most well-known albums in history. It's a psychedelic rock masterpiece and needs no introduction. Despite this, Dark Side of the Moon has some dark secrets itself. Did you know this song helped fund Monty Python? Here are 10 shocking facts about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Stick around till the end of the video to find out the dark side of this classic album. Number 10. Roger Waters. Roger Waters was no stranger to Pink Floyd. He'd been contributing the lyrics since 1968's A Saucer Full of Secrets. However, Dark Side of the Moon marked the first time Waters had taken the reins for an entire LP and wrote all of the lyrics. Though it definitely wouldn't be the last time he did it, Dark Side was a huge step forward for the band. Waters wanted to make sure the lyrics were more direct and lucid than anything they had done before. Waters explained this was always his big fight in Pink Floyd, to drag it kicking and screaming back from the borders of space. Syd Barrett, the band's original leader, was the one who wrote the lyrics for the early Pink Floyd albums. Let's just say things changed quite a bit with Roger Waters taking over his responsibility. Though Waters' lyricism on the album did also plant the seeds for the eventual rift between him and the rest of the band, at the time it was welcomed with open arms. David Gilmour admitted to Rolling Stone that he never rated himself terribly high in the lyrics department, and was glad that Roger Waters could come in and take over. At the time, the fact that Roger Waters was the sole lyricist for Dark Side of the Moon wasn't so much a shocking fact as it was a fact that would eventually lead to great success for Pink Floyd. Number 9. Eclipse. Everyone knows and loves the title Dark Side of the Moon, and it's the title that the album eventually got. But believe it or not, this was actually not the original name for the album. Well, it was, but it wasn't. Let's explain. Before settling on Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd almost named their classic record Eclipse. The idea behind this was to emphasize the lunacy that was present in some of the songs. Though this idea would be echoed in other places on the album, it wasn't enough to keep them from changing their minds. The reason that Pink Floyd decided on calling their album Eclipse and almost went through with it wasn't because they wanted to. Believe it or not, Dark Side of the Moon was always intended to be the name of the album. But when a British blues rock band called Medicine Head released an album with the same name in 1972, the Floyd had to scrap their original plans and go for Eclipse instead. Though this was a minor setback and annoyance for the band, it didn't take long for them to revert back to Dark Side of the Moon. Thankfully they did, because we can all agree that Eclipse would not have been half as iconic or memorable as Dark Side of the Moon is today. Number 8. Early Concert. Believe it or not, Pink Floyd fans were treated to Dark Side of the Moon in concert more than a year before the album was actually released. That's right, Pink Floyd debuted all of the songs that would eventually become Dark Side of the Moon at the Brighton Dome on January 20th, 1972. It wasn't until over a year later in March 1973 that we heard this classic record from our stereos and Walkmans. Though there were many changes to come over the course of their live performances, it was these early shows that acted as the test runs for what would eventually become one of the biggest and most iconic albums in rock history. Number 7. On the Run. Out of every song on Dark Side of the Moon, it's the instrumental piece On the Run that had the most drastic transformation from its live debut to its studio record. The original live version was a classic jam song showcasing guitar solos and an upbeat rock attitude. However, when they eventually recorded On the Run in the studio, it was a completely different song. Thanks to the EMS synth AKS, On the Run received a total electronic makeover. This synthesizer contained a built-in keyboard and sequencer which allowed Pink Floyd to craft this instrumental piece into what it is today. The transformation was so drastic that many people wouldn't have even known it was the same song. Number 6. Money. Money is one of the most successful and well-known songs that were on Dark Side of the Moon. It's a classic hard rock and funk hit. Believe it or not, this track wasn't always like this though. According to guitarist David Gilmour, Money was actually heavily inspired by the Memphis R&B group Booker T and the MGs. If you listen closely, you can hear the funkiness that was laced into this classic rock jam. Though admittedly the recording all but covers up the Booker T and the MGs' influence, it's still there thanks to Gilmour. Money reached number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 in July 1973, earning itself a spot as Pink Floyd's first top 20 hit in the United States. Number 5. Paul McCartney. For all you Pink Floyd superfans out there that know everything about this classic record, here's a fact you might not know. Paul McCartney was actually involved in the making of Dark Side of the Moon. The former Beatle was at Abbey Road Studios when they were recording parts of The Great Gig in the Sky. Paul McCartney was interviewed and even asked to sing, but unfortunately his answers were deemed unusable by Roger Waters. Apparently, McCartney was trying to be funny, and while Waters appreciated the effort, it wasn't what they were looking for. Thankfully though, McCartney still managed to make an appearance on the album. If you listen closely to the end of Eclipse, the album's closing track, a passage from an orchestral version of the Beatles' Ticket to Ride can be heard. This song was playing in the background at Abbey Road Studios when Jerry O'Driscoll was being recorded. Number 4. Us and Them. Another one of the most iconic songs on Dark Side of the Moon is Us and Them. This song began life in 1969 as a lovely piano and bass instrumental called The Violent Sequence. It was written by Richard Wright and Roger Waters and submitted for inclusion in the soundtrack of Michelangelo Antonioni's counterculture drama Zabriskie Point. While 3 Pink Floyd recordings were included in the film, Antonioni felt that The Violent Sequence was not appropriate for it. More than 2 years later, the band revisited this demo and recast it as a meditation on war and poverty, turning it into the song that we all know as Us and Them. Number 3. Silver Surfer. Everyone knows the iconic imagery on the Dark Side of the Moon album cover, but did you know that it almost looked totally different? Before settling on this particular prism design, Hipgnosis, the creative agency behind the artwork for many of Pink Floyd's album sleeves, considered other designs. One of these was an image of Marvel Comics' Silver Surfer character. This would have been a bold and memorable design that made sure the album stood out from other albums, but copyright trouble just isn't worth the trouble when it comes to decisions like this. Number 2. US Top 40. Believe it or not, Dark Side of the Moon was actually the first Pink Floyd album to make it into the US Top 40. Though their previous albums had been popular amongst critics and even sold well in the UK, none of them had the impact or success of Dark Side of the Moon. Thanks to a massive promotional push by Capitol Records and regular spins on money by American radio DJs, Dark Side of the Moon rose all the way to number 1 on the Billboard 200 within 2 months of its release. Number 1. Monty Python. Those old enough to remember Monty Python and the Holy Grail can thank Dark Side of the Moon for its existence. As Pink Floyd was recording their spacey classic, they often watched Monty Python's Flying Circus on BBC Two during downtime. When the comedy troupe needed more money to complete the film, Pink Floyd stepped up and provided 10% of the total £200,000 budget. And so, a cult classic was born. So there you have it, 10 shocking facts about Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. Are there any other interesting facts that you know about this classic album? Let us know in the comments below. If you haven't already, remember to leave a like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future content, and we'll see you in the next video.